Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise on behalf of the Greens to speak on the Residential Tenancies Amendment Social Housing Bill 2018, which seeks to implement a bond scheme for public housing tenants, which includes termination of tenancy for non-payment and also introduces mandatory termination of tenancy where someone living in public housing or community housing is found guilty of certain fraud offences. Minister Goward stated in her second reading speech that this bill aims to send a clear message to tenants that they have a responsibility to look after their properties and be honest in their representations. Well, I have a clear message to Minister Goward and the Liberals and the Nationals. You are the ones shirking your responsibilities when it comes to looking after public housing properties and the people who live in them. And you are the ones who are not being honest in your representations when it comes to the potential outcomes of this bill. This week is National Homelessness Week. This year, the Minister for Family and Community Services and Social Housing has chosen Homelessness Week to introduce a bill to this place which places further financial hardship and pressure on public housing tenants and makes it easier for people living in public and social housing to be evicted if they are not able to pay. Pop quiz. For those playing along at home, what happens to a person when they are evicted from public housing? Yep, that's right. You don't have to be an expert to get that one. They become homeless. Perhaps Minister Goward thinks that Homelessness Week is about doing what you can to contribute to homelessness. The bill before us today has two key functions: to implement a bond scheme for social housing tenants, which includes termination of tenancy for non-payments, and to allow the termination of tenancy where the tenant is found guilty of certain criminal offences. In relation to the bond scheme, this bill enables the New South Wales Government public housing providers to require...
When you direct your comments through the chair...
Mr Speaker, I'm very happy to tell you that apparently the rental bond will only be required if a tenant has caused significant damage to the property, but details of how this will work are set up in ministerial guidelines, which we have not yet seen. In addition to that, under these yet-to-be-seen guidelines, existing tenants will be required to pay a bond if they cause significant damage to a property. Again, apparently no rental bond will be required if a victim of domestic or family violence where the damage is caused by the perpetrator. However, again, it is unclear to know how this will be determined, and if the incident happened as a result of a domestic violence incident, how this will be applied. Similarly, it's unclear how it will be applied, that these requirements will not be put on people with ill health or the inability to maintain the premises, despite the fact that we're assured in the ministerial guidelines that will be there. Now, let's go back to the fact that here we are at Homelessness Week. For most people, for me, for the Greens, for people with compassion and a heart, Homelessness Week is usually an important time for us to highlight the challenges of people facing homelessness. But it seems that the Liberal Minister for Family and Community Services and Social Housing has a very different approach. Let's cast our minds back to this time last year, when the Minister for the Minister for Family and Community Services and Social Housing marked Homelessness Week by rushing through legislation that increased police powers and forcibly removed homeless people from Martin Place. Rather than acting with compassion and using the stark reality of the tent city set up in Martin Place to address homelessness, the Minister simply tried to get the problem out of her sight. Happy Homelessness Week from the Liberal and National Party. This heartless act was so lacking in compassion that if asked this time last year if I thought that it could go further this year, I would have said no way. I would have said no way. But lo and behold, here we have it. Let's say that a tenant is slapped with a $1,400 bond. They will presumably get a letter telling them that they need to pay this within 14 days. If they are on a basic New Start payment, they are getting $545.80 a fortnight. That is $272.90 per week. Imagine, to any of you, the Minister included, the stress of getting a letter telling you that you were required in 14 days to pay 5 times of your weekly income. Let's put this in perspective, shall we? On my calculation, the Minister
Order.
for Family and Community Services
Order.
would get a letter telling her that she needed to pay $30,630 on her salary. That's 5 times her weekly salary of $6,126 per week.
Order.
And be required to
Order.
pay it in 14 days. And sure, I've heard the interventions. I have read the bill. I have read it closely. And it is possible that those tenants will be able to pay that back over a number of years. But let's imagine the stress put on those vulnerable people knowing that they have a debt that large hanging over their heads for 1, 2, 3 years, when they are earning a measly amount on New Start allowance, when they are trying to get their life back on track. This is complete cruelty. Aside from the extreme financial hardship of this bill would impose, we are extremely concerned about the punitive nature of the bill. What we are seeing in this bill is the second attempt by the Minister for Family and Community Services to provide extrajudicial, outside of the criminal justice system, punishment to people living inside of social housing. We have seen that when it came to the local allocation strategy, and now we are seeing it in relation to this bill. What we are seeing here in this bill
Order.
is a mandatory requirement for NCAT to terminate tenancies as a result of tenants committing certain criminal offences. We hear the Minister yelling and intervening, and I would ask the Speaker if he could ask the Minister to not intervene. I did believe that the Minister was heard and was without us intervening at the time, and I would ask the Speaker to consider it. It might be that the Minister is getting so defensive about this because of the fact that the reality is that what we will see is what we will see.
The member for Ballina rises on a point of order.
Mr. Speaker, I would ask that things be directed through the chair, according to the standing orders.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, given the interruptions, I'd ask for an extension of time.
That's terrible.
Mr. Acting, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Order.
Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Order. Sorry?
Was that a point of order?
Is that a point of order?
No, I believe the member for Heffron has one.
Right.
I move in accordance with the standing orders that the member's time be extended.
It's been moved by the member for Heffron that the Speaker's time be extended by 5 minutes. All of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the noes have it.
Ayes have it.
A division has been called.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It appears to be, just for those members that might not have been watching what was happening in the chamber at the time, what happened here was a situation where I began to call out the Minister for Family and Community Services for the failures to introduce such a lacking in heart and compassion bill. In Homelessness Week, the Minister began to interject. At that point, there was time lost, and I requested an additional information of time.
Order. The member for Riverstone rises on a point of order, do you?
Mr. Speaker, the member has been given additional time to address the bill, not to criticise the Minister or talk about other matters.
Thank you. Call the member for
Thank you,
Newtown.
Mr. Speaker. I go back to the focus of the bill. The focus of the bill is to create more homelessness in New South Wales by evicting vulnerable public housing tenants. This bill will require NCAT, give NCAT mandatory requirements to evict people that are convicted of certain criminal offences. Now, claims that this punitive bill will promote behavioural change from tenants are clearly misguided, when it is often underlying mental health or drug and alcohol issues or domestic violence situations which are the causes of these problems. The real behavioural change needs to come from the Minister and her department, who are clearly failing in their obligations when it comes to providing support, essential maintenance and assistance to those on the public housing waiting list. This bill will place further unnecessary pressure on vulnerable people who are living in social housing, people who may be struggling to maintain their tenancies as a result of lack of mental health support, which is also a responsibility of the Liberals and Nationals, people who may be survivors of domestic violence, people with a disability, people who are elderly or at risk of other social and health outcomes and circumstances. I note a broad range of stakeholder groups, including the Tenants Unions of New South Wales, the Homelessness New South Wales, Shelter New South Wales, People with Disabilities Australia, NCOS and the Combined Pensioners and Superannuants Association of New South Wales, raised serious concerns about this bill and issued a joint statement calling for the plan to be dropped amid concerns that it will make life harder for people living in public housing, increase administrative costs to family and community services, and be unlikely to have any benefits for the department's costs or the tenants' behaviour. It's also worth noting that in their statement, these key organisations referred to the announcement and introduction of this bill as a surprise change from the New South Wales government, which begs the question what the minister was referring to when she stated in her second reading speech that this bill is the culmination of an extensive consultation process, including consultation with non-government service providers, peak bodies and government agencies. I would ask the minister in her reply to clarify which non-government service providers and peak bodies she consulted and what they actually said, because it would be quite misleading to this House to say that these peak bodies were widely consulted on this bill, when in actual fact, when engaged in the consultation, they said that they opposed the introduction of these measures. So I would ask the minister to respond to that question when she replies. There are so many other questions that I believe also need to be answered because they are being referred to in ministerial guidelines which are as yet unseen, potentially undrafted. It is all unknown. Will people living in public housing be required to pay a rental bond irrespective of whether they have taken full responsibility for the damage and paid the damage costs? What if they didn't cause the damage? How do you define the damage? When was it caused? What were the exemptions? Who determines if it was the perpetrator or the survivor of a domestic violence incident that caused the damage? Given the department's track record on inspections and maintenance, could this now mean that we have a situation where public housing tenants are forced to pay bonds for damage caused years ago by former residents or by neglect at the failure of housing to actually maintain their properties? We know that the current maintenance backlog for public housing is out of control. Tenants living in public housing are already responsible for damage and cleaning costs. There is no need for this bill. It is a punitive measure. It is a measure that is seen as another way for the minister to evict people from public housing to address the disgraceful waiting list as a result of failures of successive governments in New South Wales to invest in adequate amounts of public housing to address the outrageous backlog of public housing in this state and the ever-growing numbers of homelessness. The minister is creating a cruel game of musical chairs that will increase housing insecurity and financial stress for those most in need. It will disproportionately affect people with mental illness, people that are vulnerable, and it will be used as an excuse to target specific groups. People in need of a place to call home will be stuck in a circular loop of housing insecurity where they will be kicked out of public housing and become homeless, approached by a homelessness housing specialist team when they are sleeping rough, placed back on a waiting list with priority status, and then to enter the cycle again. The Greens oppose this bill and we condemn the Minister and the Liberals and Nationals for this heartless and cruel piece of legislation introduced in Homelessness Week. This bill will seek to further increase the financial hardship on those who are most in need and further increase the number of people who do not have a safe place to call home. It should also be noted that the New South Wales Labor Party is not opposing this bill, and it is very, very disappointing to me, to housing advocates and to public housing tenants and vulnerable communities to hear this. It makes it clear from the member for Sydney's contribution that it is the Greens and the Independents in this place that are standing up for social justice and are the real opposition. I know that the Liberals and the Minister would prefer me to not be in this place and raising these concerns, but I know that the hundreds of thousands of people that face housing insecurity and that face the reality of being evicted because of these cruel and heartless policies and pieces of legislation are pleased that we are here. The Greens oppose this bill. It is an absolute disgrace.